You're listening to Gender, a Wider Lens.
I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States. Since 2016, my practice has been exclusively dedicated to gender-questioning teens and families impacted by gender dysphoria.
I also work with gender-questioning teenagers, and I facilitated support meetings for families and individuals who've been impacted by gender issues.
We're curious about the concept of gender and how it's unfolding in the wider culture.
Join us as we look at gender through a wider lens.
Today's interview might be a bit different from what our listeners are used to, but we think it's crucial to recognize the many arenas of life where gender identity beliefs get elevated. Not only do they get elevated in progressive or classically liberal institutions, but even within religious institutions, which you might think are inoculated from a radical gender identity takeover. Our guest, Bernard Randall, initially studied classics and ancient history, the subject of his Ph.D., but after feeling the call to ministry, he added theology to his studies and was ordained in the Church of England in 2006. After a spell in parish ministry, he entered educational chaplaincy in 2011, first at Cambridge University College, then at Trent College, a fee-paying K-12 school near Nottingham with the Church of England Foundation. He had a general awareness of the issues around gender and gender identity, but was forced to face these head-on in 2018 with the arrival in his school of Educate and Celebrate, a pro-LGBT+ program. Randall completely agreed with the organization's aim of eradicating homophobic bullying. But when staff were instructed to charismatically chant, "Smash heteronormativity," Bernard felt that this was at odds with Christian beliefs. When a pupil requested in 2019 that he give a sermon in chapel outlining some of the differences between traditional Christian beliefs and LGBT ideology, he decided to take this request very seriously. He carefully crafted the sermon to honor everyone's right to believe what they believe. He encouraged pupils to make up their own minds about these contemporary LGBT issues, but also to respect those with whom they disagreed. He was initially sacked for gross misconduct, but then reinstated with a final written warning and censorship of all his sermons. When COVID struck, he was put on furlough and eventually made redundant. He sued the school for religious discrimination and unfair dismissal. The court hearing was in September of this year, with the results not likely to be handed down before January 2023. We think this was a pretty remarkable discussion. In addition to Bernard's story, we also delve into some of the philosophical and therapeutic issues around things like detrans, ex-gay, emotional fragility, and whether or not we put enough trust in young people's resilience. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Bernard Randall.
Hi, Sasha.
Hi, Stella. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing really well. We're very glad to have Bernard Randall here with us today. So thank you so much for joining our program.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Sure. So as usual with our guests, we like to kind of go back and understand how they came to do the work that they're doing. And then, of course, we want to hear all about your court case because, of course, that relates to gender identity and teaching of it in schools. But you're an ordained minister. Can you share with us a little bit about, what got you interested in pursuing that path? What does that look like, day-to-day life of Bernard Randall? And then we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it's a funny question to ask in a sense, because the obvious answer is, well, God got me involved in it. I was asked that one time at a university reunion. Someone said to me, why did you choose to get ordained? And I said, well, God. And that's...
and they said, oh, God.
But yeah, I grew up in a church family. My dad was actually a vicar, now retired. So it was definitely in the sort of milieu. And growing up, especially as a teenager, people would always say to me, oh, are you going to follow your dad's footsteps? And I always said, no, not a chance. There's no money in it. But then I went off to university studying classics and ancient history.
Well, there's loads of money in ancient history. Sorry.
No. Eventually there might be more than being a vicar, but yeah, not much. Anyway, so while I was doing my PhD, I got the call for ordination. Basically, God got hold of me and said, "This is what I want you to do." Is basically the simple explanation. I'd always been a churchgoer. I have two brothers, neither of whom ever go near the place, but it stuck with me, and that's the simple answer. Sort of in my 20s, I thought, no, I think that might be the thing I'm called to do, and tried to resist it for a while, but eventually there was obviously what I had to do. That sort of sense of internal drive, I suppose. Put myself forward for ordination, and the Church of England has all sorts of processes for checking people's vocation. You can't just roll up one day and say, "I'm going to be a vicar." And they confirmed the ordination sort of vocation and sent me off to train. So it was 3 years training, studying theology. So yet more education. And then you do 3 or 4 years as a curate, to sort of apprentice to a more experienced priest, and then go off and do your own ministry, depending on what that might be. So I did a bit of parish ministry, and then into educational chaplaincy. That's sort of, having done a lot of education myself, that felt like a natural place to be.
Wow. And when they ask, do you mind me asking, I don't think I've ever met any vicar or reverend. When they ask, they're checking your vocation. That's very interesting. It almost reminds me of somebody who might be checking somebody's beliefs before as therapists, before somebody embarks on a very big decision. Is it similar to that, or is it in another way?
I guess it probably is. Yeah, I'd never thought of it that way, not spending lots of time with therapists. But I suspect it probably is. There's a sense in which you're talked about why the Church of England. Do your beliefs actually fit reasonably well with the Church of England's beliefs? Is this the right place for you? What's your spiritual life like? What nourishes you? You're asked, what is your relationship with God and Jesus, and what does this all mean to you? And they're looking for someone who has a depth of faith and an understanding of what you're letting yourself in for, but also someone who they think is going to stay the course, because it's the sort of thing where people can get really enthusiastic and they've suddenly converted and they're real driven by this enthusiasm. But then after 3 or 4 years, it sort of fades away, and I didn't really mean it after all. So they want to check that it's deep and abiding. So the process to get approved for ordination can take anything from 9 months minimum to 4, 5, 10 years, depending on. Some people are told, no, go away, come back in a while after you've done something, whatever it might be. So I think it took me 2.5 years going through the system gradually, just sort of, and you do placements in churches that are not like your home church, so that you know kind of what the different things out there are, and you'll know that you're realistic about it.
I've heard of loads of people in Ireland, loads and loads, who joined the seminary to become a Catholic priest, and ultimately didn't get through, and are now very happy that they never became priests or nuns. But it's not an unusual story. Certainly wasn't a few decades ago. It's a common one.
I mean, I don't want to jump into a different arena, but that's so interesting that they actually want you to be really thoughtful and careful, because they know that the passions of the soul can be overwhelming.
Yes.
And that it can lead people into maybe a fantasy idea of what it would mean to be a priest. Or, I mean, obviously I don't need to draw the parallels for our listeners here, but wow, isn't that nice to have a mindful, thoughtful process where you're also exposed to different types of churches because you may not like them. And then you really have to do some soul searching. That's really amazing. And you were young when you made these decisions. You were in your early 20s, right?
I was, sort of mid-20s when I started thinking, actually, ordination might be the thing after all. And I went off to train, I think it was 29, so ordained at 32, 33, whatever it was. Trying to work out the maths of how old I am. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
But yeah, they're in a sense, they almost try to put people off, because as with many professions, if you're the wrong person doing that, it's a disaster. And a vicar who's given up on God is not a good thing for a community to experience.
It does feel very like, I know identity is the new word these days, while vocation was, almost the old word for that. If you I know
Yes.
you could make an analogy somewhere along those lines.
You definitely could, but I think a key distinction I would always want to draw is that a vocation comes from outside, whereas identity is talked about as coming from inside. And actually, I think one of the key insights that religious people might have in this sort of field is the things that we are given from outside are often much more important than what's from inside. So the notion of being created in the image of God, that is given to us, whereas a lot of identity politics and whatever effectively seems to be man made in the image of man. We make ourselves how we want to be, and given how foolish, let us say, some people can be, most people are sometimes, making ourselves in our own image is often not going to be a good idea, I would suggest.
Yeah, for sure. So when you got this calling, I imagine that's very personal, but is there anything you'd be willing to share about how that felt or what that experience was like?
Oh, I think that's quite difficult to describe, really. There's this sort of quiet compulsion. There's a sort of nagging away at the back of your head that you can't get rid of. A sense that you can see a job that needs doing, and you're able to do it, and it would just be wrong. It would somehow be immoral or not true to who you have been made to turn away from that job and say, "Oh, I'll let someone else do it," or actually, it's not that important the job after all. But actually, you keep getting drawn back to this sense of, I have to do this if I am going to be me, true to myself. Then I have to do this. I'm being pulled and pushed and drawn in this direction, and sometimes you go there willingly, and sometimes you think, "Oh no, do I have to?"
This is very familiar.
After a period of time, the answer is yes, I do have to. This is
That's
just
how Stella feels every night when she has to make dinner for her children.
Well, no, this is how I felt. Well, maybe that too, definitely. But this is how I felt after I did the film, and I was determined. I was releasing a book on anxiety. I'm a general psychotherapist. I was determined I wasn't going to become narrowly involved in gender. I was just going to go back, and I was, going to continue working with gender because I had uncovered an awful lot of very interesting stuff. But I was not going to be, specialized or narrowed into one thing. And I was determined I wasn't going to be. And I valiantly tried. I really did.
I remember that, Stella. You were like, well, my website has to show all the different things that I do. I don't want to just become the gender person. And you were always doing media interviews to make sure to spread yourself broadly.
Always.
But it feels like a responsibility because you recognize in yourself the ability to help in some particular way, that if you neglected it, it would be like taking the easy road out or something.
Yes, and I think speaking as a Christian, as an ordained priest, is it's you've been given particular abilities. You've been made to be the kind of person you are, and as a result of that, there are particular jobs that are set out for you. And lots of Christians will talk about God has this plan for your life, and I wouldn't necessarily use that language very much myself. But on the other hand, I can look back over things and go, oh yeah, actually, that has turned out not as I expected, but rightly. So one of the things about being involved in court cases and whatever is, you have to have a certain stubbornness and you have to have a certain commitment to the cause. And if I had been perhaps less of a sometimes bloody-minded sort of person, I probably wouldn't have stuck with it. I'd have gone, this is too much. I can't do this. But I have felt compelled, I just have to do this, because if I don't stand up for what I understand to be truth, who is going to? And when you get ordained, one of the things you're basically saying in the sort of public ordination service, promising to the bishop who ordains you, is, I am going to be someone who stands up for the Christian truth. I'm going to be the public face of this. I can't now shy away. So, having made that promises matter to me. And and that's quite unfashionable in this day and age. But you make that sort of deep promise and you live by it, and I think that's essentially what I've tried to do all the way through.
Well done. Am I right in thinking you became a school chaplain, or that's what I would call it? Is that the same?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And would you have been known as a very holy chaplain, a very holy man, or was it?
I doubt it.
Yeah. Do you wear
know.
it lightly in your day-to-day life?
I mean, I think, I always wore the clerical collar around school, so they could, there was no hiding who I was, and sometimes people would comment on how nice that was, that they knew exactly what they were dealing with. There was no hiding it away. Because not all school chaplains do wear the collar, and that's different people, different styles of ministry, different
Very
personalities.
much so, yeah.
That's fair enough. But I always would, and people would, pupils especially, use the name of Jesus as a swear word quite often, as people do. And if I'd hear it, I'd sort of give a joking, I don't think he's got anything to do with it, or something like that. I wouldn't tell them off, but I'd just sort of gently,
I've got the picture of you.
Do you know what you're doing, kind of stuff. And so, yes, I was clearly what I am as a Christian minister, but I hope not holier than thou and distant. One of the things we had in the school was an annual football match between staff and sixth formers from one of the boarding houses in aid of children in need. It was a charity in Britain. And the staff team would always have more than 11 players, so rolling substitutions and whatever. And the volume of support from the pupils watching always seemed to go up when I went on. So I think they had this sense of, here is the chaplain being not a holy person and appreciating that. So, chants of Father Bernard scores and we're coming on were sometimes heard, which I loved. It was great. And then I'd turn and give them a little sort of ceremonial blessing just to say thank you very much for your support and get on with playing the game. And so it's approaching that sort of with a sense of humour, I hope, taking what I was doing as a minister totally seriously, but not taking myself seriously. That's sort of what I aimed for.
And did you like being a school chaplain?
Yeah, I mean, it's in many ways it's a wonderful job to have. Because you have this privileged position of being able to talk about important things. And I think, spiritual, moral, ethical things are important regardless of religious affiliation or otherwise. So you have the position of being able to sort of give some thoughts in that area that hopefully land home and people stop and think about. And the teaching as well, and just sharing my knowledge and my love of learning and whatever, that kind of stuff. So lots of it absolutely brilliant. I mean, it turned out it wasn't the best school to be a chaplain in for reasons we'll go into, I guess. But
so maybe we can start now talking about what happened at the school. And I'm also curious about timeline, because you talked about this kind of experience you had at the games, and I'm thinking about, wow, you had a whole history of being a prominent person within this school, because as an outsider, I read about the case and it just kind of drops you in the middle of the chaos.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to just get a sense of you must have been there for some time. You had developed relationships with all these students and these other staff. Tell us a little bit about your time at the school before this LGBT thing happened, and then kind of get into the event itself.
Yeah. I joined the school in 2015. And the first year I was there, I did classics teaching. And then the second, third years, I did religious studies. I'm just trying to think, fourth year, religious studies, and then I was going to do more classics. But so I did taught various things, sort of ranging from year 7, sort of 10, 11-year-olds, up to sixth form, A-level. So being part of that, I ran the chess club, I did a little philosophy club. I joined the sort of the cadet force as padre to the cadets, and that kind of stuff. So, trying to be involved in the life of the school in all sorts of ways beyond just standing up in the front of chapel and leading acts of worship. And it was all going absolutely swimmingly for a few years. And, I'd not taught in a school previously, so I was learning the craft of being a teacher, and I was probably not the world's best teacher to start with, and well, definitely not, and still not the perfect teacher by the end, but, definitely getting the hang of it and enjoying it. And then in 2018, we had a staff training day led by an organisation called Educate and Celebrate, which is a pretty extreme pro-LGBTQ plus organisation, and it has a sort of headline thing of tackling homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying in schools, which is good, great. No one is going to object to that. But also aims to embed sexual orientation, gender, and gender identity in the life of the school. And as soon as you hear the words gender identity, someone who's thought about these things a bit is going, oh, hang on a minute. And at the staff training, they had all the teachers at one point chant, smash heteronormativity. And that's sort of straight out of queer theory. So it's not just this benign, let's be nice to people. It's a very political agenda that really, what's going on here? And as a Christian minister, smashing heteronormativity, I'm sorry, Christianity is pretty heteronormative for most of history, certainly.
And they had the teachers, am I hearing this right? They had the teachers chant, smash
yes.
heteronormativity, and they did chant it.
And well, many of them did, yeah. It was peculiar. I mean, I was sitting towards the front, so I don't know how many people joined in, but a good number of them did. Some perhaps just because that's what you do, some because they believed it, some because they were too embarrassed not to.
I don't want to labour the point, but you're given training. I give training to schools. You're given training in school. I've never had anybody chant anything. I'm stunned at this. How did that arise? Like, how did they say, and now we will have a chant?
It was sort of built up to it. So it was a sort of a whole, I'll say a whole morning. It was certainly a 2.5 hour session. It was a long session going through sort of early stuff about how it's okay to talk about sexuality in schools because, going back 20 odd years, you weren't allowed to, and now you are, and that's fine. And then sort of building up through the different sets of ideas, almost like a sort of revivalist preacher,
yes.
getting the audience, the congregation,
whatever,
gradually worked up and involved in this, and it was, it's hats off, really well crafted session. And so towards the back end of the session, talking about what do we want to do about these various things, how do we want to move forward to make sure that everyone is LGBT friendly, and the notion that love is valued by everybody, all that kind of stuff that you hear that sounds so lovely until you sort of unpick it a little bit and see what's really going on. And then at one point just had up on the screen, I can't remember, there were a couple of other slogans as well, but it was what do we want to do?
Smash
and put to the screen and everyone goes, smash heteronormativity. Really?
Wow.
So I didn't join in with that because I knew what that meant, or had an inkling of what that meant. But lots of people did. And then jumping forward in the story, when we came to the tribunal hearings and people were giving evidence, some of them were saying, oh, well, we didn't join in because it was a bit embarrassing and it was just a bit too cringy, really. We didn't take it seriously. Or, well, I joined in, but I didn't really know what it meant. And you just think, if you didn't know what something like that means, don't join in at all, and then ask the question afterwards. And that's what I did. I said afterwards, I went to the deputy head, who was my line manager, and then actually the head teacher came across. I said, a lot of this presentation is absolutely fine, totally on board with anti-bullying and stuff, but some of it runs counter to Christian values. We need to have some discussion, smash heteronormativity. And one of the other particular concerns was that the trainer had given this list of the protected characteristics in English law. And instead of sex and gender reassignment, which are 2 of the 9 characteristics, they had gender and gender identity. And you don't make that mistake accidentally. it's a totally deliberate thing. And I knew perfectly well that was not what the law says, and that's importing something completely different. So I said, we need to have these discussions because this isn't right, and some of it's counter-Christian values. And they said at the time, yeah, great, we'll do that. And then time went by and there was no discussion.
And can I ask, how did you know? Because most people would have gone to that training. They would have heard the chants of smash heteronormativity and been a little bit wide-eyed, but they would have presumed everything on the screen was correct. And that if somebody says there's a protected characteristic of gender and gender identity, they would have presumed that is correct because this is a professional group who've been brought in. They're paid to produce. This couldn't be so shoddy as to get such important wrong information.
Well, absolutely. Well, there's this wonderful thing we have nowadays called the internet, and you can look stuff up. And so at the at the end of the previous summer, there had been an email went out to all the staff saying that the staff training at the beginning of September is going to involve these elements, which they always did, advance notice of what was coming up. And I saw this educate and celebrate thing. And I can't remember if it gave any information at all about him. I thought, oh, that's a bit odd. Okay, let's look at that. So I just Googled them, and up came their website, and it was fairly obviously a very, very aggressive pro-LGBTQ plus whatever. And so I dug a bit deeper into actually what they were doing, and the notion of smashing heteronormativity hidden somewhere deep in the website. It took a while to notice it. I saw that and I thought, oh, hang on, Googled that. Other search engines are available, and worked out what was going on. And this fed into stuff I already knew some stuff about, but I was being basically forced to investigate more deeply because actually, as the school chaplain, moral and ethical matters come under my remit. So
you said you already knew some things about some of this.
Yeah.
And this kind of training and the organization of their website prompted you to look further into it. Do you remember, let's say prior to this happening, how did the whole concept of gender identity first come across your radar? What do you remember before this?
It's a bit tricky to work out because, of course, you learn so much all the time that unpicking what you knew when is tricky. But we had in where I lived previously, the church I tended to go to when I wasn't working on a Sunday, had a male to female transitioner in the congregation. So there was an awareness arising from that. And then I know that in the prior year at the school, one of my sixth form classes was a bunch of 4 boys, all full of testosterone and quite an entertaining little group in their own way. And we had some good fun. But we'd sort of do this intellectual banter, and they were always trying to keep up with me, and that's how I kept on top of them, because they're big lads. I mean, one of them was sort of 6'8" rugby player, so you have to find a way to be the alpha in that. So it's the intellectual alpha, if not the physical, because I'm definitely not that tall. And they were talking to me about these things that they'd seen on YouTube, and they were talking about. It's Milo Yiannopoulos, I think, and Ben Shapiro. And I had a look at those, and I thought, Milo Yiannopoulos, no. Ben Shapiro, clearly a provocateur. And I probably would agree with a lot of what he says, but I'm not sure I would be totally keen on the way he goes about some of it. But they also talked about Jordan Peterson. And so I watched a few YouTube things with Jordan Peterson and thought, actually, here is someone intelligent and thoughtful, clearly highly intelligent, and looking at some of these issues. And he was doing sort of Bill C-16 type stuff and use of pronouns and whatever. And so I was getting more aware of the debates. So I was aware of the existence of these issues, but then that got me sort of clued into the debates a bit more.
I'm dying to ask you what happened next, but I just want to comment on something before we go further. Not that many people read the booklets, not that many people read the information. And when you said, at the end of the year, they kind of flagged, this group are going to come. I would say you were one of very few people who said, oh, I'll check these people out. And it reminded me very much of Will Malone. And he was in our podcast a long time ago now. And he saw the details with the Endocrine Society, and he thought, oh, I wonder what that's about. And he read it. I remember saying to him, well, I'd say you're unusual. I would say lots of people don't read it. They just presume, roll with it. Oh, I must read it. Quick glance just beforehand, but wouldn't actually slowly study what is being offered. And I think that's been really revealed in this world. There's an awful lot of nodding along, presuming things are fine. And a lot gets through. But that's my little comment.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And you know, there is that element of nerd in me that wants to, you know, once I've got hold of something, I want to find out about it properly and learn it. And that actually that connects to what I was saying earlier about that vocation and that sense of God made me the way I am so that I would do a particular job. You know, it might well be he made me a nerd so that I would actually follow up on a particular email, so that I would then be in a position to speak out.
A likeable nerd. So what happened then? So you said, right, we're going to have to talk about this, smash heteronormativity. As you said, this is a Christian school, and that's fundamentally, I think what you think is that's anti-Christian, because Christian is fundamentally heteronormative.
Yes.
So there was a kind of a point that smash is a very aggressive word, and chanting to me is anathema to teachers.
Yeah. And smashing is, you know, that's the revolutionary Marxist side of queer theory coming through, and that's not something you should be doing in a school, whether Christian or not.
Well, right, and I'm kind of just interested in that choice of a chant. It's like, I mean, unless you believe in this queer theory conception that all of us would all be pretty gay if it wasn't for heteronormativity, it's like you're kind of ostracizing probably 95% of your student body if you want them all to smash their own sexual orientation. I mean, it is a bizarre chant, rather than like accept everyone. Like, I could see that as a chant, but like smash the straight kids.
Well, remember, this was in a staff training session, so the pupils probably didn't ever hear the phrase smash heteronormativity, but it's like the sort of the mission statement for Educate and Celebrate. What we want to do. This is our key goal.
Right.
We're not going to tell people that this is our key goal. As I said, when you go to the website, it's not front and center. I had to dig for it a bit. But it's you know, we're going to set up this program of I think there were sort of 30 things they expect the school to do, changing policies and putting things in the curriculum, and doing fundraisers for Educate and Celebrate, just to make sure that, you know, when you've paid them the fee, that the money keeps coming in, that kind of stuff. But none of those 30 things say smash heteronormativity, but add them all up together, and the goal is this sort of total revolutionary overthrow of the established order into what they imagine is going to be the golden world of everybody being thoroughly queer and nobody having any boundaries or whatever, which, you know, speaking as a Christian, I think that just sounds like chaos, and who wants chaos?
We hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. We work very hard to maintain high quality content for this show, and we're grateful to Rhyme and GenSpect for supporting us.
Rhyme, or Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics, is a non-profit organisation dedicated to improving long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
And GenSpect is an international alliance of parents and professional groups whose aim is to advocate for parents of gender-questioning children and young people.
If you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts and special Q&As, and you can join our listener community.
Now back to the show. So as you were preparing this sermon, was this something you were like losing sleep over? Were you sweating bullets while writing? Like, I'm just imagining, or did you think, oh, this is going to be very, you know, non-controversial? I'm just wondering, like, how much energy did you feel needed to be invested to word it carefully, or were you just shooting from the hip? How was the preparation process?
Also, just to add to that, was it as a reaction because you had asked the headmaster to speak about it and you felt, you know, he effectively fobbed you off? He didn't grab
well, we sort of missed out the middle of the story in a sense. So the staff training was September, heard nothing about it, and then there was another staff training session in January with they had a sort of set of parallel sessions, and one of the options was what's going on with Educate and Celebrate. And I thought, okay, I'll go to that. And the person leading it said, we've decided to go for the gold award and put in place the whole program. And I was thinking, hang on a minute, that's not what I was told. That was not what I was promised. So there's more of the story to tell. But basically, I was not best pleased. But it was clear there was not a lot I could do with it. So I was sort of keeping the head down, but thinking, okay, what is the appropriate response to this? And then every summer term, I would say to the pupils, you tell me what you would like me to talk about. Give me suggestions for topics that you want to have discussed with, any kind of faith, spiritual, moral sort of topics. And they'd come up with all sorts of things. And the week before the fateful sermon, I'd been talking about the possibility that the entire world we experience is a computer simulation, and we're just sort of algorithms in the computer, and whether that could make any sense. So, it really was, anything could be talked about. But one of the pupils had said to me a few weeks before, have you got a spare slot for a sermon? I said, yes, I have got one left. And he said, could you talk about how come we're told we have to accept all this LGBT stuff in a Christian school? And I think the way he asked the question, we're told we have to accept, was really significant. So that made me think, I have to talk about this. This is my duty to talk about. And so, yes, I put a lot of thought into writing a sermon, and I don't normally write the full text. I would just sort of do bullet points and speak slightly more informally to that. But I thought, no, I need to get this absolutely spot on and say exactly what I want to say, what I mean to say, and not slip up and inadvertently say something that wouldn't be appropriate. Because I'm aware, there are sensitivities in this area. So I did put quite a lot of time and effort into getting it right. I don't know if I lost sleep over it necessarily, but it was on my mind in a way that most sermons are not.
But were you confidently I'm in a Christian school, I know my stuff, and I'm going to say something that is thought out and gentle and appropriate?
Yeah, basically. And I was sort of thinking maybe my line manager might say, hang on, why did you do that? And I'd say, well, because actually that's my job. And he might be a bit disgruntled, ruffled feathers kind of thing. But how could they possibly object to speaking about Christian beliefs in a Christian school, in the chapel, in an act of worship, Little indeed did I know. And I was conscious that it might be something that got back to parents, that, the chaplain said such and such. So I actually sent the sermon to a sort of local theologian to say, is this all absolutely correct in terms of what the church teaches and whatever? So that if the school got complaints from the parents, they could say, yeah, no, we do know exactly what we're doing, and this is properly Church of England, and there's no objection to it, sort of thing. Not that helped me either, because the school were unwilling even to countenance this stuff. So I gave the sermon twice towards the end of June of 2019. And so on a Wednesday and Friday, and then on the Monday, I was called in to speak to the deputy head, my line manager, and the school's safeguarding lead. And they basically interrogated me on why I'd given the sermon. And it didn't matter whether what I'd said was true or what the faith element of it was. All that mattered was how people were feeling about it. And what are we going to do about it?
And was the religious aspect dismissed, or was it you are being excluding by not smashing heteronormativity, or what was the... And also, I haven't really said the main message of actually the sermon.
Right, the sermon, yes, so worth saying. So, one of the things that probably upset them was I started off talking about Brexit, because I said that when it comes to Brexit, I think that some people value the economic arguments of leaving or staying in the EU, and some people value the political sort of democratic arguments for leaving. And it's not that one is right or wrong, it's just which you prefer. So the different set of ideas is what you vote according to, but they're not right or wrong, they're not facts. And from that notion of, there are different competing sets of ideas, I went into, with regards to sort of Christian values and stuff, I've been asked this question, how come we're told we have to accept LGBT stuff in a Christian school? And my answer was, some of the stuff you should accept. No one should be discriminated against. No one should suffer abuse or personal attacks because of who they are. We're all made in the image of God. We're all loved by God, but there are some differences. And on those differences, you can make up your own mind. So you may believe that marriage is properly only of a man and a woman, and that sexual activity as an ideal properly only belongs in such a relationship. You may believe that biological sex is real and sometimes makes a difference and can't be changed. You may look at gender identity language and say, this is incoherent, you can't make sense of it, so it can't be more than partly true. That was the main thrust. And then I finished by saying, but wherever you fall on these, the most important thing, respect the people you have disagreements with, respect the sincerity of why they've reached the conclusions they have. And that's what we have to do, but make up your own mind. And that it's fine if you do agree with the LGBT stuff, absolutely fine, no problem. So I thought it was quite moderate, and, listeners can read it for themselves online.
Yeah, I've listened to it, and I urge people to listen to it. I thought it was moderate. I thought for me, the main message was make up your own mind, which I think is a lovely message to send to young people. It didn't feel to me that you were pushing your thoughts, although you were saying you had them, nor were you pushing theirs, but you were pushing the point of make up your own mind. That's the message, maybe, I think correctly, I got out of your sermon.
Yeah, that's certainly what I was aiming for. So I'm reassured that an intelligent, thoughtful, non-religious person such as yourself would get that message. Because, that's exactly what I was trying to do. Respecting the fact that I wasn't speaking to an audience composed entirely of Christians or even traditional Christians. So, that was the message of the sermon, is respect people's disagreements, and the school leadership.
And how did it go
trampled
down?
all over that. Well, not well, it turns out, with a small section of the school's community. And actually, the only people who spoke to me directly, some pupils who said it was interesting, thought-provoking, enjoyed it sort of thing later that afternoon. One pupil, she said to me that I hadn't gone far enough with giving the biblical view of marriage and sexuality and whatever. So fair enough. So this is the only negative comment someone directly said to me. But then lots of people had gone to the deputy head or the head and sent in emails, and mostly staff, saying, we're worried about this.
I think there's something interesting here. The mode by which people provide their feedback can really skew the perception within the institution or even the general public about how something lands, right? Because the kids who say, oh, Reverend, that was pretty interesting, or I really like that, or, well, I don't agree with all of it, but you've given me something to think about. They're not writing emails like that to the administration. They're not saying, that was a thought-provoking sermon. I'm going to have to sit on that for a couple of weeks. It's the people who are enraged who write in. And so that can create this false perception that there was a huge kind of backlash against your sermon, or that it was taken terribly by most students. And then, I just find that to be really interesting, that of course it's not the moderate, thought-provoking perspectives that get emailed to higher ups.
And I think that's, I'm very glad that you've reflected that, because actually I tried to say that during the whole disciplinary process against me. And I said, well, actually, most people were probably okay with it. And very often the people who are very positive about something won't make a comment, because we don't generally.
Right.
It's only the people who are unhappy that actually complain. So that skews the thing. And that was used against me to suggest I wasn't taking the complaint seriously, because it was just assumed by the senior leadership that 90% of people were unhappy.
And another thing, too, there's something about this kind of contemporary belief about like words being harmful that also prevents the email writers from approaching you directly. Because like just from having spoken to you, I would guess that had a student or a pupil come to you and said, Reverend Randall, I really felt very sad by your sermon, can we talk about it? Or I was really upset. Yeah. I'm sure you would have given that student space to think it through and talk together, and maybe you would have even reflected on some things they had to say. But the way of like just tattletaling on you behind your back by email is part of the problem. Like, it does not actually help us to bridge these gaps.
Yeah. I'd certainly like to think that if someone had come to me and said, here was my problem, then we could have had a civilized conversation about it, you know. And actually, it was almost all the emails of sort of, as it were, complaints. Some of them were sort of expressing concern, as people do sometimes. I think there were 10 separate emails, 10 or 11. 9 of those were staff. The staff should be grown up enough to come and have a word with me. And actually, a lot of them were thinking I had said things which I simply hadn't said. Yeah. Which, you know, people make mistakes and when they only hear it once, but they could have emailed me and said, could I have a copy of the sermon?
Right.
I was a bit troubled by it. Can we have a conversation? And they just didn't do that, which is, you know, it's disappointing when you've got these colleagues who you would hope would be a bit more grown up about it.
Yeah, this exact thing happened to me. I had a former colleague who I had known for years. After I left that school where we worked together, she had basically just been following me online, and she wrote a formal complaint to the licensing board. Never did she reach out to me or ask me to clarify my position or said, Sasha, what are you doing in therapy with these kids? Like, she just built up her own assumptions and took what I believe is the kind of cowardly route to just report me. Of course, it got dismissed, thank goodness, but like that feels like such a non-productive way to go about things. And then I also, as an American, when I was reading about this story, I learned a little bit about this organization, I guess, called Prevent. You were reported to like the counterterrorism watchdog. So tell us about that. Right. Help us understand, because that seems... I mean, we're talking about extreme now. That seems very extreme.
It felt extreme at the time. It was terrifying, to be honest. So they called me in for this interrogation on the Monday, which did not go well. They'd said they'd send me copies of the anonymized emails for me to look at beforehand. They didn't do that. So I was expected to discuss how people were feeling and what had been said, on the basis of having about 90 seconds to look at all these emails. And of course you can't do that, you know, and apparently I didn't show enough empathy for them. I didn't know what they were thinking. How could I possibly... Anyway, sorry, I could rant about it and I don't want to do that. But then the school initiated this disciplinary procedure. And after I discovered in the process of I was sent various documents for that the school's safeguarding lead had contacted Prevent, which is the government's anti-terrorism, anti-violent extremism organisation, so basically a branch of the police, to report me. Because in that meeting, they felt that I had entrenched views. But really what I was saying was, well, the Church of England's teaching is just what the Church of England's teaching is, and it's not for me to change that. So about as entrenched as a mathematician saying 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, it just is. But the fact that I wasn't going to show remorse for what I'd done, and I didn't even really know at that stage what I'd done, was worrying to them and so on. It's you know, it was a cultural revolution struggle session. I was supposed to fall to my knees and confess all and show all this remorse. The trouble is, I didn't know it was a struggle session. They didn't tell me this is what you're supposed to do, and I was a bit dense about that. I don't know. Anyway, so I just in these documents it said, and we've reported to Prevent, and I have these visions of the Secret Service and intelligence service breaking down the door at dawn and seizing all the computers in the house and all that kind of, and so really, really scary stuff. Unfortunately, it was only a couple of days until the actual disciplinary hearing, and as part of that, I got to ask questions. So one of my questions was, do you think that the Church of England is a terrorist organisation? And the head said, oh, well, no, and probably we should have told you the referral to Prevent came back, didn't merit further interrogation. I said, yeah, you should have told me. Yes, you should have told me that.
Oh my God.
So yeah, just emotional roller coaster would not begin to cover it.
And where were your thoughts going?
Well, in terms of, I mean, I know I'm not a violent extremist, and I know that I said in the sermon, no excuse for personal attacks or abuse, which ought to cover that pretty well. Respect other people is not what you get violent extremists saying. But if the world is mad enough that somebody thinks that's worth reporting to prevent, then the world is also mad enough that the prevent officers take that seriously and come and visit. And what does that do to my career or my family? And just, horrifying in so many ways. So they did that. They also reported me to the safeguarding authorities. So I'm basically accused of being a terrorist and a child abuser.
And when you say they, who is they?
The school. There's the designated safeguarding lead at the school seems to have sort of taken the lead. Well, that's her job in doing this. And I think that she is pretty committed to the cause of, queer theory,
but
frankly.
On what basis? Because I'm not familiar with the kind of British safeguarding kind of standards, but on what basis could that sermon or your behavior before or after be seen as a threat to child safety? I don't get it.
No, nor do I.
Is it like the quote emotional harm of?
It's that sort of thing, yeah. And all the kids would go off and commit suicide from hearing this sermon. Kind of, that. So that's the kind of excuse they use, which is not helpful to anybody, because it's basically saying, LGBT kids cannot cope with hearing a different opinion. They're so fragile. And of course, you reinforce the fragility by treating them as if they're fragile and victims all the time, rather than letting them develop their own thinking and resilience and whatever. So, so there's no rational basis for referring me at all. And it was weaponizing safeguarding against somebody whose views she didn't like is essentially what it seems to come down to.
Did many people contact you privately, or were you ostracized, or how did all that happen?
Well, I was suspended, so people were basically not allowed to contact me. So I all of my support network was taken away from me, basically, in that sense, which just made me very isolated. So yeah, that was really difficult. And that summer was a very low time.
Oh.
Because you've been accused of these terrible things. You don't know what's going on with your life. Career is potentially over. I mean, it is over in that sense. I'm never going to work in a school again, I wouldn't think, because of all of this.
Wow.
So it's tough. It's tough. And then I was sacked at the end of August for gross misconduct for as I understood it, doing my job. I was sacked for gross misconduct. I appealed to the governors, the sort of board of trustees, and they reinstated me with a final written warning, but a list of sort of 20 conditions, which included censorship of all my sermons and not broaching any topic around the school that might cause offence to anybody, that kind of stuff. And then COVID hit, and they used that as an excuse basically to make me redundant, because they said, we don't have enough money because the income's affected by COVID. And hence legal action for religious discrimination. I mean, Church of England minister in a Church of England school suing for anti-Christian religious discrimination. It shouldn't be possible. It should be a joke.
I want to touch on this because I don't know if, even for me, when I hadn't heard of your story until Stella pointed it out to me. And as I started reading about it, I kept thinking about this line that I hear a lot from gender critical leftists, which, I mean, I'm definitely part of that circle, which is let's say a person identifies as trans. They're allowed to believe that they're a woman, let's say it's a male person, but they can't force the women in their social environment to believe it as well. And I think this is a very core philosophical question about autonomy and autonomy of beliefs, autonomy of religion, autonomy of how you see the world. So I think this is so interesting that, like, even within the context of a Christian school, you are an ordained minister, which by definition implies that you do have certain beliefs that you have a right to, that even you can't express those beliefs while also holding space for other beliefs because your sermon is very moderate. Like, it's shocking because the whole point of the sermon was nobody can tell you what to believe. And that's what radical feminists are constantly saying. That's what the gender critical left is always saying. Nobody can force beliefs onto others. So I think your case is a really great example of how even in a supposedly religious institution, you're not allowed to hold those religious beliefs or whatever beliefs they are. It's really mind-blowing.
Yes, it is. And I think part of that comes from this notion of the sort of the extra vulnerability of LGBT people, which, you know, many people who are same-sex attracted and transsexual and whatever do experience poor mental health. But the question of whether that is because they are gay or lesbian or for other reasons, or actually they're just comorbidities, as it were, that they just happen to be in the same person, is totally unexplored.
Or you know, an awful lot of us, I don't know if I've met many sensitive people in the world who've found life difficult. There's many of us who have mental health challenges.
And that doesn't give license to, like, verbally abuse people. We're just saying, like, these are complicated philosophical questions that everybody has a right to think about and explore.
Yes. And might be really helpful to them.
Yeah.
You know, I know there are Christians who would describe themselves as ex-gay and, you know, Christian detransitioners, and they would say that their faith has made their life better. And who am I to argue with that? You know, we might go, okay, interesting, but nevertheless, that's their experience of their own lives, that they should be allowed to sort of go that way, as long as they've not been coerced. You know, as soon as you start coercing people in whatever direction, that's not good. So I think faith does potentially have resources to help people deal with all sorts of things. And if you say, oh no, you can't talk about faith in these areas because people are already too vulnerable, you're denying them a source of help. So, for example, I think that the Christian notion of the fall and the fact that everybody is imperfect is a way of saying it's okay to be imperfect and you are still loved and lovable despite all your imperfections. And if we say that to people, I think that's a really positive thing from which to build a life with the imperfections included, rather than trying to run away from imperfections.
Well, this is really interesting because this has come up before a couple of times. And I think what you're saying will be heard by some that being gay or being trans, whatever that means, like, I'm not even sure I understand what the word trans means, but that is a, quote, imperfection, right? And that we're all fallen. But the question of ex-gay and ex-trans/detransitioner is really tricky because I think a lot of people get hung up there because, you know, activists on the kind of pro-affirmation side often draw that parallel, and then they point to the coercive and really torturous practices of conversion therapy against gay people. And I have met a couple of people who call themselves ex-gay too, and it's very interesting. I mean, it's not like people I worked with very closely, but there are these weird parallels, like, oh, I just live with same-sex attraction. The way someone might say, oh, I just live with gender dysphoria. And then my mind gets a little bit scrambled because I tend to be, I mean, I definitely think sexual orientation is something we should affirm insofar as we don't attempt to change it. But it's so tricky. I mean, I just think this is such an important conversation, and I didn't want us to just glide over it because I know our listeners are going to be perking up.
I'm fully aware of how tricky and sensitive that is. And part of the problem with activists on both ends of the spectrum, because, you know, Christian activists can be, you know, unhelpful in this too, is that they don't allow you to have that conversation and explore the space in the middle and work out that what's right for one person isn't necessarily right for another person. And And yes, when I say we're all imperfect, I mean that literally. All of us are imperfect. So none of us is living exactly the life we imagine that we ought to be living. I'm quite sure. And that's okay. And the Christian faith has resources to deal with that and help us towards wholeness, whatever that looks like for each person. And we don't want to prejudge what's right for each person. But unless we can have those discussions, and that's why the freedom to speak about these things from a religious or philosophical or other perspective is so vital, including in schools. Because if kids are reaching 18, never having been challenged or never being told you're allowed to think different thoughts on these topics, the chances of them doing so in the next 20 odd years are very low. And then they hit middle age and they're going, why am I so unhappy?
Oh.
And if only someone had told them earlier, they might have sorted out some of the issues.
I kind of think, in a way, a lot of the beliefs you might hold might be objectionable to many people, but I think that the way you hold them is not objectionable, if you follow me. That
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I get that.
I think that's an important point to make, that I believe anybody should have their they can believe whatever they want, so long as they hold it in a way that it doesn't foist it upon other people.
Yes. And I think we should always, and it goes both ways, we should always be willing to have our minds changed.
Yeah.
If someone comes to me and explains this stuff in a way that I just hadn't thought of before, opens my mind, I change my opinion. That always has to be the potential. And as long as we're open to those discussions working both ways and exploring, somewhere between us, we get somewhere closer to the truth.
Mm-hmm. And ironically, as somebody who doesn't believe in God and who doesn't believe in gender identity as this, soul identity, I find it very similar. My response is actually very similar to both people who believe in one fervently or the other fervently, where I'm like, I'm glad that gives you comfort. I'm glad that you have your beliefs, and I'm glad you're not foisting them on me. And we can roll along with that. I can roll very, very easily along with that. That's perfectly cool.
Yeah.
Something else is kind of coming up for me as I've been marinating on this. I think there's an underlying belief in the institutions and the people who work with children that it's our job to counteract unhelpful forces in the child's life. So, right, I'm thinking about, let's say, we've heard so many stories of a person who maybe they were having same-sex attraction and they were told by some person or another that that's bad. We think it's our job to help counter that so that they can come to terms with their beliefs or their internal sense of self. And what I'm realizing is actually, it's each individual's job to take full responsibility for sorting out those questions. And if we have a little faith in the young person, we can present lots of ideas in a way that isn't abusive, right? In a way that isn't coercive. Yep. And each individual person really has to sort that out for themselves. I think the same thing is true even for questions of whether a young adult is going to transition. They need to be given all the options. They need to be told the truth about possible outcomes, where this might come from. And some of those facts may feel distressing. But at the end of the day, I think we do have to have a little more faith in young people that they can hold maybe distressing, conflicting opinions and eventually sort it out when they're, old enough to, or they're in a safe environment. And that feels like we're putting too much of a burden on adults to handhold children to conclusions about everything.
Yes, we're trying to level out the experience of adolescence so there are no ups and downs. And that's clearly nonsense. I mean, that's just not how life really works. And if you do that, you produce young adults who are not able to look after themselves mentally, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, whatever. And we need to be much better at saying to kids, this is going to be up and down. Here are some resources. Here is what a lot of people have thought. Here's another thing that different people have thought. Work out for yourself. Explore it. Ask questions. We'll do our best to guide you through these, whomps of experience. But at the end of the day, you have to get to the other side yourself as best you can. And we hope we don't lose too many on the way. But if we insist that there must be no child ever experience unhappiness, we're actually also saying no child should ever experience happiness, because you can't have true happiness unless you've got something to compare it to, and unless you've earned it, really.
Wow. That's really lovely. I do because I'm aware time is going on, and I want to get back to the plot a little bit here because it's so interesting. Even though that was really lovely. So, did you prevaricate much about taking the court case? They said gross misconduct, which seems egregious, and then
Yes.
you took the court case, and were you happy with how the court case went, and what's to play for now? Because
yeah, I mean, I didn't prevaricate very much about taking the court case because, as I was talking earlier, when you've been put in a position and you think this is the truth and I'm called to stand up for this, and the truth being the importance of freedom of speech and freedom of religion rather than the truth of my own particular beliefs, and that's the key to what I'm trying to achieve, so that other people in schools can speak out, say what they really think. So that was an easy call, really. I mean, not that the process is easy. I wouldn't recommend it to everybody. You have to be of a certain character, I guess, to stick with it. Fortunately, I've been supported by a group called Christian Concern, who have done pro bono legal work for me. Otherwise, it wouldn't really have been feasible. And they've been a massive support. So shout out to them. But yeah, so we were supposed to have the tribunal hearing in June of last year, and the school didn't get its act together and produce documents it was supposed to, so it had to be postponed. And because there's such a backlog, it got put back, whatever it was, 15 months to September this year. So we had the hearing in September, the sort of evidence phase of it, and I think that went pretty well. We were kind of happy with how the evidence came across, and the school's witnesses seemed to be inconsistent, shall we say, in what they were saying. We think that was clear enough. So there were written submissions to go through in October, end of October. The tribunal panel meet again in November. We'll get a result January, maybe February. So it's a lot more waiting. But the most difficult part, the sort of sitting in front of a court and being cross-examined by a lawyer, I've done that bit, and I thought that went as well as I could hope.
Well done. On my mind is, let's say, Kevin Lister, the maths teacher who sought the consent of the parents before he changed the pronouns of a student, and Enoch Burke in Ireland, who has his own issues, but is still in jail, is in jail tonight, was in jail for the last month for his own beliefs. Now, a more complicated case, and certainly there's an awful lot of issues that are kind of side to the point around he didn't want to call a pupil they, them. So it feels like it has really taken off in schools in the UK and Ireland. Have you any message to say to teachers? And because how do you think it's going down in the schools?
I think it's really difficult to know, because the people who sort of rebel against the gender identity orthodoxy don't want to stick their heads above the parapet for obvious reasons, because the punishment of just being put through the process is pretty significant. But I think the tide is turning. I very much hope that we will win my case, and that will establish a precedent that people can point to, and they can say, yeah, but what about Randall? Just as in other areas of employment, in gender critical circles, people can say, aha, Forstatter.
I was about to say, you'll be the Maya.
People can say, aha, Randall, yeah.
You'll be the Maya Forstatter, either of the Christians or of the teachers, hopefully of the teachers.
Well, both of everybody who believes in the freedom to speak and explore these topics properly, rather than simply bowing to what the sort of the diktats of an authoritarian ideology. So that's what I'm hoping for, that it will establish some kind of grounds for people to have a bit more confidence. And the more people that get that confidence, the more people will speak out and suddenly realise, oh, I thought it was just me, but actually it's him and her and them over there. And all of a sudden the dam bursts. So that's what I'm hoping. Whether it happens, of course, is another matter. But
Well, we're very glad to be able to bring your story to an audience that might otherwise have not heard it. Like I said before, I wasn't really familiar with this, but this is a really important story that highlights a lot of issues that come up over and over again for those of us who are interested in this. So thank you for coming on the show and telling us about what's happened, and good luck with all the proceedings in the future.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me on. I feel sort of imposter syndrome because you have such wonderful, knowledgeable people on, and there's little old me. But it's been great talking to you.
Can anybody contact you if they want to? Are you on any social media? Is there any way to contact you?
Because of the court case and because of the things that people out there behave like towards people in my situation, I have kept off the social media. But you've got my details, so if people desperately want to contact me, they can probably go through you.
Okay.
If you're willing for them to.
Yeah,
we'd be delighted to.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens. This podcast is sponsored by Rhyme and GenSpect, and listener support means a lot to us. The best way to help is to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Follow us on social media, and if you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts of the show, special Q&As, and you can join our listener community. Just go to our Linktree. That's linktr.ee/widerlenspod.
Our discussions are for educational purposes only and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.